Hello, and welcome back to the Prince William Sound Natural History Symposium. Our final presentation for this evening is with Milo Burcham and Charlotte Westing presenting on their research of black bear populations of Prince William Sound. If you have any questions for our presenters, please put those in the Ask a Question tab at the very bottom, and please put any comments you have in the chat box. Milo Burcham is a wildlife biologist working for the Chugach National Forest based in Cordova, Alaska for the last 20 years. He is currently the subsistence program lead on the Chugach, working with rural communities on the forest to implement the federal subsistence program. In this capacity, he has worked with black bears, moose, Sitka black-tailed deer, and mountain goats within Prince William Sound. Charlotte Westing has worked for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game for 18 years in the communities of Kodiak, King Cove, Dillingham, Kotzebue, and has been in Cordova for the last 8 years. Her experience involves working with almost every big game species in the state of Alaska. Please welcome Milo and Charlotte and their black bear research.
And they are connecting now.
Perfect.
Hello.
Hello.
This is Milo's hand. Here's Milo.
Hey.
Hello, welcome.
And yes, so we're happy to be talking with you all today. We're doing this cooperatively like we do a lot of our work. So I'm going to talk first and then I'll hand over to Milo. So let me just get my screen share going here. I'm not seeing what I need to see.
If you scroll over your photo, there should be a little like picture of a screen on that.
Yeah, it's just not showing me the windows again like it was in the practice time. Let's try this.
Looks like we got it, yeah.
Okay. All right, so when I showed up in Cordova, people immediately wanted to start talking to me about black bears. And so I'm excited to talk with you all about what we've learned in the time that I've been here and through the research project that Milo and I started together between Fish and Game and Forest Service. So I'm going to do part one of our presentation, and that's going to be talking about the life history of black bears, their importance to both the economy and the ecosystem, how the landscape of users in Prince William Sound has changed, and then some management challenges and changes that we've faced. And then I'll go over some of the harvest data and talk about what we've learned from that. Then I'm going to hand it over to Milo. He's going to explain our cooperative research project that we started in 2016. And then he'll hand it back to me, and I'll just explain the direction of our analyses. And our analyses are mostly being done by John Skinner, and he's a spatial analyst with Fish and Game. So let's get into the life history. Black bears use all different kinds of habitats. They use forests, coastal sedge meadows, avalanche slides, alpine meadows. Those are all important areas to them. And they're pretty easily differentiable from brown bears by some of their physical characteristics, such as having short, sharp claws that are good for climbing trees. There's a difference in the profile shape of their heads. So their heads have a more rounded nose, whereas brown bear has what we call a dish-shaped face. They're also quite a bit smaller in body size. And then if you were just to find a bear skull on the beach, you can actually tell the difference between a brown bear and a black bear by looking at their upper rearmost molar. On a brown bear, that molar will always be longer than an inch, and on a black bear, it will always be smaller than an inch, regardless of their age. So non-black color phases in Prince William Sound of black bears are really uncommon. We don't have cinnamon bears very often at all. And usually our bears are pretty much all black with occasionally having a white chest patch. Probably more than occasionally, but yes, white chest patches happen, but rarely more white than that. So I'm going to open up a poll. And I don't know if you guys have done these at other parts of the conference, but poll number one will be about how big do you think a black bear is in Prince William Sound? So we'll see if that poll pops up for you and have you vote, and then see if I'm able to see the results of that. I'm not sure if I will be.
Yeah,
we may just have.
Just so folks know, the poll is just at the bottom next to ask a question. So it's anonymous. Anybody can do it. You can change your mind and vote on something else. So go ahead.
Yeah, so vote on which answer you think is right for how big black bears are in Prince William Sound. And then I'll tell you about reproduction. Black bears mate in between June and August. They form pretty solid breeding pairs during that time, but there's not fidelity, at least between the male and the female. During the period that she is receptive to mating, they want to spend all their time together. But as soon as that period is over, he's gone off to someone else, and spending a lot of time roaming beaches, just maintaining knowledge of the receptivity of any females he may come across. Meanwhile, she's staying very true to her home range. Then after fertilization, the egg starts to divide and becomes a blastocyst in the body. So it won't actually start implanting and developing into a fetus until the fall, once they're in dens. And it will only implant and begin developing into a fetus if she's reached a certain body condition threshold. And so if bears don't get enough resources throughout the summer to get through the process of birthing and be in good body condition or acceptable body condition, they just won't get pregnant. They produce between 1 and 4 cubs, but usually it's about 2. And so what you end up with is an every other year breeding cycle. Obviously, if she loses her cubs, she may breed again and fall out of an even or odd year pattern, but usually they're breeding every other year. So am I able to see the answer to poll number 1 now?
Yeah, so I don't know if you can see it, but it looks like most of the votes, 52% of the votes were for 210 to 350 pounds.
Okay.
Second place, 150 to 230, and third was 265 to 400.
Okay, so the actual correct answer is 150 for females and 230 pounds for male. Those are our averages of adult animals that we've handled. So for that to be the second choice wasn't completely terrible. Okay, so then pick up where I left off here. What do they like to eat? Well, they're always opportunistic, so they'll eat whatever they can find. But early in the spring, they're focusing on freshly sprouted green vegetation, which is often on the coastal sedge meadows and avalanche shoots. Then in the summer and fall, they're focusing more on salmon and later on berries, particularly in the alpine. And we don't believe that in Prince William Sound, terrestrial meat makes up very much of their diet at all. And a large part of that is just the fact that there's not a ton of overlap between where it is a good place to be a deer and where it is a good place to be a black bear. When they're denning, they go into their dens in the fall, and that's related to photo period. And we call it a denning period and not hibernation because they're not true hibernators. They're repressing their metabolic capabilities greatly during this time, but they can still get up and move around. And our collar data show that they do get up, and we get locations from them in the winter. Most of them stay in and they don't move that much, but they can certainly do it. They can use rock cavities, hollow trees, or they can just dig holes. Most of the dens that we've found have been kind of the interface between a tree root system and some boulders or rocks. Bears are going into their dens. Generally, the first ones start to do it in the middle to end of September. Most of them are doing it around the middle of October, and the last of them are going in about the middle of November. Then when it comes time to come out of their dens, in general, the males are coming out first, and they're doing that in the last couple of days of March, first few days of April. Then lone bears, so bears that don't have cubs, are coming after that. And finally, sows with cubs. Most of the animals are coming out in mid-April, but some will come out as late as the first couple of days of May in some years. Black bears are important to the ecosystem because they are a huge vector for transferring marine-derived nutrients from the ocean ecosystem into the terrestrial landscape. And that has a trickle-down effect throughout the entire food web because it makes plants more productive. So if you have fewer bears, you may have less nutrient deposition, and that can lead to less productive plants and a less productive ecosystem altogether. Bears are also important to the economy because they're the second most pursued game species in Prince William Sound. Statewide, they're the third most sought after species for hunting and fifth most sought after for wildlife viewing. And hunting contributes more than $500,000 to the economy each year in Prince William Sound. Wildlife viewing contributes over $5.5 million in Prince William Sound. And while that doesn't specifically focus on bears, they are considered a highly desirable species to see on tours. So at this point, you're probably wondering how many bears are there, and I'm not going to be able to tell you that, but I can tell you that there are more bears in the northern and western Sound than there are in other parts, the east of Cape Fremantle, and it's probably related to their overlap east of Fremantle with brown bears, which can limit populations. If we wanted to try to use an average density of about 600 bears per 1,000 square kilometers, which is considered pretty good density, that'd be about 3,700 bears, but it's really just a wild guess. But the one thing we did know is that since the early 2000s, diverse users, so guides, transporters, hunters, researchers, non-consumptive users have consistently said they're not seeing as many bears as they used to see, and they were concerned about it. So what has changed? Well, the user landscape has changed. The Exxon Valdez oil spill increased the awareness in general of the beauty and resources of Prince William Sound. Some people call it the people spill. And then additionally, the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel, also known as the Whittier Road, opened up to light vehicle traffic in June of 2000. So prior to 2000, you had to load your truck and trailer and boat on a train to take it through the tunnel or drive all the way around to Valdez. And so you can see in the late 90s, about 20,000 people were using Whittier to access the Sound. It jumped in 1 year to 80,000 when that Whittier tunnel opened. And you can see it's generally increased since that time. It's an interesting dip last year, and that's probably a combination of both the pandemic and our ferry schedule. Spring trips are just really popular. They're multi-purpose. You can set out shrimp pots, you can fish for rockfish or halibut, and you can hunt for bears at the same time. So about 30% of the traffic through the Whittier Tunnel happens in the months of April, May, and June. So I'll give you the quick who, what, where, why, when, how. Non-locals are taking more than 59% of the harvest is taken by non-local Alaskan residents. So those aren't people who live in Prince William Sound. They're not residents of Valdez, Whittier, Cordova, Tititlik, or Chenega. And they're selecting, some people are selecting for old boars, but many are just happy to take whatever bear they see. So it's a pretty non-selective harvest. Most of the harvest, over 84% of it, is taken in the spring. And most of that is taken after May 21st. So Memorial Day weekend is the big time for taking bears. 82% of users are engaged in spot and stalk. So they're not baiting bears. They're just spot and stalk hunting. And 84% are self-supported. So they are not using commercial services for their hunt. If the ones that do use commercial services use transporters for the most part. And they're hunting for both hides and meat because there's a mandatory salvage requirement in the spring. And I bring all this up just to show you how difficult it is to dial back the harvest on this group of people. Because you can't, in Alaska, we consider all Alaskans to be subsistence users. And so we can't restrict the harvest of a meat species without great caution and care. And so that's why, it wasn't as simple as just, well, don't allow baiting. And it wasn't as simple as just restricting a certain type of commercial service. It's been a tough nut to crack. So you can look at this map to show just where the distribution of the harvest has been, although this map is for the last 5 years, so it's changed a little bit from when it was at its highest. But you can see big popular areas are, 75 to 90% of the harvest is in Prince William Sound, but recently Valdez has been more popular. And proximity to Whittier and Valdez are big driving factors in these hotspots, but you can see Colross is a hotspot. This is Unaquik here. That's a hot spot. And then over down by Bainbridge is another hot spot. And it can also be accessed through Seward. So now I'd like to give you just the walkthrough of some of the different things that have changed over time with the harvest. So we started sealing black bears in 1973. Then the Whittier Tunnel opened in 2000. So here you can see in the late 90s, we were taking about 200 bears a year. And then this year that's labeled RY99 is the first year that the Whittier Tunnel is open. So you can see a big jump in that year, a 50% jump. and then it starts to climb. And so they imposed restrictions in 2003 on shooting from a boat. And then in 2005, some restrictions, they changed the length of the season. So instead of the season going to the end of June, they set the close, and when I say they, I mean the Board of Game, changed the season length to end June 10th. And they also that year created some closed areas to bear baiting and made some other specific regulations for bear baiting. But you can see, despite those changes, the harvest continued to climb until its high point in 2007. And you can see at that point, it's at almost 600 bears. It's almost 3 times what it was in the late 90s, or 10 years prior. So they changed the season length again in 2009, but that time changed the fall dates. So instead of starting September 1st, it would start September 10th. And we don't believe that really changed anything, considering that only about 20% of the harvest is in the fall. But the harvest was already on about a 5% annual decline starting in 2011. And then the next year, we had snowpocalypse. So you can see a big change, a 5% annual decline until 2011. Then in this RY11, that's the year of the 100-year snow event that we refer to as snowpocalypse. And this blip up in harvest, I believe, is related to probably the fact that there was snow in lots of areas of Prince William Sound until July. And bears came out and were having a tough time finding something green to eat and were conspicuous on the landscape. It's also possible during this time that fewer females had cubs when they came out of dens because we had a much higher percent take of females. Then the year after that, we see a 23% drop, then a 48% drop. And then in RY14 is when we really started changing things. So that's the season that I shortened by 2 weeks with emergency order. It still included the Memorial Day weekend, so I don't know how much of an effect that had on the harvest, but it was 2 weeks shorter. And then the Board of Game passed a registration hunt, which began in RY15. That's when we started having a registration permit. So you may be wondering, why is this percent take of females? And that was shown as a green line, but I've separated it out here on this graphic for you. Why is that important? And it's important because females, you could have a combined effect when you have lots of females in the harvest of you're killing more females, and that will impair your ability to produce cubs in the future. But you're also potentially killing them because they don't have cubs. If a female's only available for harvest every other year, half of the years of her life, she's not harvestable. And so it could be you're losing breeding females and losing their inputs at the same time. And males are more conspicuous for harvest because they cover these large areas pursuing food or mates. So they should be easier to find. So when you're ending up with a bunch of females in your harvest, it can be a big red flag. And the thing you'll notice about this is our harvest objective has been for less than 25% of females in the harvest. And that's standard across coastal areas. But you can see that for most of the year since the Whittier Tunnel opened, we've been above that 25% mark. But the good news is recently we haven't been, and I'll get into that in a minute. So what caused these changes or the increased take of females? Well, could be a lot of things. Changes in weather could have affected both bear abundance and bear distribution. So I talked about the big 100-year weather event in 2011, 2012, which was a big snow event, but we've also had some big weather events as far as really warm winters with virtually no snow. And those could have also had an impact on bears. We have some evidence that black bear numbers are down across a broader area. So on the Kenai Peninsula, even though they don't show the same magnitude of change that we have, they've showed the same trends. And we're going to be looking into that a little further. Some people have suggested behavioral changes so that bears are saying that bears are using the landscape differently and that bears are avoiding beaches more. But we can look at that with our radio collar data. That's one of the things we're doing with it. Some people say, well, there's just fewer people going out to hunt. Well, we do have effort data now, and I'm going to talk about that next. And then there's this question of, were our harvest rates too high on bears for a period of time? Or is it likely that it's some combination of the above? And I think this is the most likely. I think we were potentially harvesting bears at too high of a rate. And then we had a big environmental event and we didn't have enough buffer in our populations to absorb that. But it's anybody's guess. Here's what we know about effort. Prior to 2009, we don't have any way to know about people who hunted and didn't take a bear. All we knew about were bears that were dead. In 2009, we started using harvest tickets to monitor bear hunting, but they had a lot of problems and it was challenging data to work with. This was the real advantage that the Board of Game saw with going to a registration permit, is that it allowed me to get more timely information on when a bear died. Previously, if someone killed a bear, they had 30 days to seal it. So if they killed a bear Memorial Day weekend, I wouldn't find out until the end of June that that bear was dead by the time it entered into our system. And that gave me no ability to respond to changes. So if we had wanted to try to limit the harvest when it was tripling or growing at a very fast rate, we couldn't have done it. And now with the registration hunt, if we see a big change, we can do something about it. The other thing we get from this registration hunt is better effort data. And what that's telling us is, yes, the effort has gone down, but if the change that we're seeing in the harvest was just related to effort, what we would see is stable or actually increased success rate because there's less competition on the landscape. If they're the same number of bears and less competition, your success rate should be higher. And that's just not what we've seen. From 2009 until 2012, you can see we're at about 50% success rate. And at its worst, it drops down to almost 10%. And you can see in the last 3 years, we've been at more like 30%. And that's a good positive sign that the situation is improving. And then this graphic just shows you the whole picture and the years since the registration hunt came into place. You can see that the harvest has climbed up and is settled out at 200. And we've been staying below that 25% take of females threshold. So it's a good sign that things are improving. And now I'm going to hand over to Milo, and he's going to explain what we've been doing with our research project. All right.
Hello, everybody. This is Milo Burcham from the Chugach Forest, running this subsistence program, and I'll tell you about what we've been doing in Prince William Sound with black bears, and a little bit why Forest Service is involved in it. The federal subsistence program is different than a lot of what the Forest Service does, in that we overlap with what Fish and Game does, and because black bears are a subsistence species in Prince William Sound, we shared the same concerns that Fish and Game did when we started seeing some of the conservation concerns. So seeing these concerns, we started talking about, hey, we'd like to do something about it. We'd like to evaluate what's going on with black bears in Prince William Sound. So we sat down together, Charlotte and I, and devised a project just kind of out of the blue. It was actually kind of exciting. We sat down and looked at the kind of things that we might be able to get a handle on and set some project goals. And those were to assess the feasibility of catching bears from a ground-based study. We didn't have a lot of money. We didn't have the money to hire and dart bears from a helicopter. So we were looking at doing it from a boat, which we had access to for little or no cost. With that, we thought we would be able to get a radio collared sample of bears and examine black bear habitat selection during the hunting season on both heavily, which would have been, our selection was Esther Island, and lightly harvested islands. And our lightly harvested island was Night Island. We'd be able to compile home range data and then compare habitat selection patterns for populations exposed to different levels of harvest. Those became our main goals of the project moving forward. But we couldn't start a project without getting our hands on some bears first. And that was a big ask. We haven't worked on black bears in Prince William Sound. We had to develop our infrastructure, our expertise, and everything to make this happen. So it was a pretty exciting time. We scrambled to get together money and the means to do it. I'm I mentioned our study areas. We selected 2 islands in Prince William Sound with different harvest densities. Esther Island, very close to Whittier, a decent population of bears, and as a result, high harvest density. And Knight Island, also a decent population of bears, but a little further away and harder to get to, showed lower harvest density. So we thought we'd compare dynamics in those 2 study areas. Habitat-wise, they're similar, although Knight Island's more mountainous. I just wanted to point out the size difference. Esther's quite a bit smaller, about 10 miles north to south, whereas Knight Island's like 24 miles north to south and closer to 30 miles if you include some islands that are nearby to the north. So it's a much larger area, and it was difficult to cover the whole thing. So we set up a means to capture black bears, and we based our trapping activity off of a boat. We had access to the Forest Service 36-foot Tenacious, and made that our home bases. We got out on it, loaded to the gills, twice a summer for 3 summers, 2016, 17, and 18. Doing this from ground, we didn't want to bias all our trapping effort near the shoreline. So we set a goal of getting a third or more of our sets a half mile from the beach, and made an effort to get some of our sets inland. We might not have been completely serious or successful at that, but strove towards that goal. We needed a motivated crew because this was actually pretty hard work. It was fun work, but it was hard. The amount of gear, the amount of hiking to and from sets, the stuff we had to carry back and forth, and then just the amount of time spent doing it. We needed motivated people, and I'll finish by recapping some of that, or giving credit to some of those people. And we started out by heading out there, not knowing a thing about black bears in Prince William Sound, and started establishing some bait sites that would eventually become our trap sites. In this process, we went through 1,800 pounds of dog food, 162 gallons of used cooking oil, 3 years of our local grocery stores, day-old donuts, and pounds of red vines, marshmallows, and maple frosting. We used this at first to attract some bears to bait sites. We looked at maps, we looked at areas that looked good to bears by geography and then just spatial arrangement on the islands, and decided on some bait sites, starting our project on Esther Island, and then the following year we moved it to Knight. And made our bait sites. We set up a camera at these sites, and going into this, we didn't know if we'd get a bear. We weren't sure what we were going to get. And we started betting about how many of our sites might get set, might get tracked bears to them, in the first week or so that we had them out. We were doing some pre-baiting before our actual trapping began. But that proved to be no problem at all. All our sites got hit, and we started getting pictures of bears right away. And then these pictures helped inform where we would do our trapping. So we got information from our cameras at what kinds of bears, a number of bears were coming to our sites, and we chose bait trap sites based on this information. Here's 2 eagles fighting over, probably not the donuts, but something. Here's an eagle flying away from a set and a black bear coming up behind it. These pictures were really interesting. And I think this female black bear is challenging us, and we said challenge accepted. So we identified some sites and moved into the trapping phase of the project. So this is a summary of where our trap sites were on Esther Island. So we were striving for a distribution around the island to get some good coverage. And this took, working in shifts or zones and moving around a little bit. But we did a decent job of covering it. There's some blank spots in the middle of it. But we tried our hardest to get away from the shoreline where we could. These look like they're all right on the shoreline, but some of these are truly a half mile in. It's just the scale is small. And then Knight Island, like I say, is a much bigger place. It's a little harder to see our trap sites scattered on here, and we couldn't cover the whole thing. We ended up working from Dryer Bay north, but the very southern end of the island, we didn't. We had to cut it off somewhere. But we still ended up with a decent coverage of trap sites around Knight Island. And then we went to work aboard the Tenacious, and this shows kind of like all the moving parts. We had the Forest Service boat that you see here loaded to the gills. We had 2 storage areas below deck, the above deck surface, and we needed bait supplies, trapping supplies, animal workup supplies, our own food for 10 days at a time, living quarters. It was our living quarters for 4 people for 10 days at a time. We had a smaller fish and game skiff for getting to and from shore. Sometimes we flew people to or from our camp. So logistically, it was, I won't say a nightmare because we loved it, but it was a lot of work. And I'll throw out the poll question here, the first one, and I'll come back to the answer in just a second. So we set out to trap bears. How do you think bears react when you approach them in a trap? So I'll leave you with that question. Please check your answers, and I'll come back to what you guys thought in a second and give you guys the right answer. So the 2 methods that we used for trapping, first of all, we tried this modified Aldrich M-15 bucket set. This was used in Southeast Alaska on a bear project that Fish and Game did successfully. And we had a mentor, Steve Bethune, come up and work with us. So it became our go-to, or at least our first trapping method. And it involved a bucket mounted in a tree with bait in the back, and bears would reach into it and get snared. The advantage of it is you don't get bycatch. A deer or something can't step into this and get caught. And it would always catch bears by the front paw. There you see the little bait sack in the back on the trigger that a bear would be reaching for to get caught. And there's a snare cable loop. You can see it going in from the top of the bucket. And it's around that opening. And when they trigger it, the snare would catch them by the paw. But going a little further into the project, we went also heavily to Aldrich Snare trail sets. The bucket sets worked really well, but we did find some bears beating them. They got smart about them, and it seemed like more so on Night Isle than Esther for no explainable reason. But we wanted another tool to add to our arsenal. And a friend of mine from Montana that I'd worked with on a bear project many years ago came up and really schooled us on this, and it made a very successful method for us. This is what a trail set looks like. It's kind of have some sticks to help guide where the bear steps. This is me making one before I kind of cover it over. You can kind of see the spring there. And the completed set looks like this, and you kind of guide where you want the bear to step with sticks. And this is a bear being captured. This is one of the Aldrich, the modified Aldrich bucket sets. A bear peeking in. This is one of the first bears we caught. Looking around, this is from one of our trail cameras near it, reaching in, and then you can see a little snare around the paw. So there's the bear being caught. That was how we got started. So this is a picture of a bear in a snare as we approached it. It's the site we saw many times, and that brings me to the poll question answer. I won't switch screens, but could you read us what the responses were?
Yeah, it looks like fearful avoidance got the most votes, and friendly and indifferent and defensive were pretty equal at second place.
Okay. Well, people are pretty smart about that. Maybe we have an intelligent audience here that kind of knows the real animals, but a lot of people expect a bear in a trap to be aggressive. And we found just the opposite. Bears were trying to get away. They weren't friendly or indifferent, but they were fearful, and we saw avoidance behavior and even submission. And I'd seen this on a grizzly capture many years ago, a grizzly that actually dug a hole and hit his head in it. And we saw a few of our bears actually just lay down, but most of them were trying to get up a tree or try to get away from us. So one bear might have shown the slightest hint of aggression briefly on approach or something, but then even then was trying to get away. So we saw very little aggression in our captured bears. So how we went about our trapping, all our traps were set with a trap transmitter. Our goal was to minimize how long we held bears in traps. They had a trap transmitter that started transmitting once a magnet was pulled, once it was triggered. We checked all traps remotely, through this trap transmitter many times a day. And we visually checked the traps, walked into every set that we had out at a time, at least once a day. And we had, up to 7 or 8 sets going at one time probably not much more than that. So our next poll question is, what time of day did we catch the most bears? I think you have some categories to choose from. I'll come back to the answer here in a second. So again, this is what it looks like when we're approaching a bear in a snare. We would initially evaluate it. We want to get an approximate weight, see how well it's caught. And from the weight, we help base the drug dose. We measure up the drug to tranquilize the bear. And then we approach it mostly with a jab stick. We started out using a dart pistol a little bit. This is actually the biggest bear that we caught up in a tree, our bear number 7. And we talked about average weights. This one weighed 295 pounds early in the season, so easily would have gone over 300, when it fattened up late in the summer. We did have a 315-pound bear that was caught later in the year, but this one, measurement-wise, was a larger bear. We approached the bear mostly with a jab stick, and we'd have somebody backing up with a shotgun just in case. But like I said, most of these bears were just trying to get away. We would jab them in the shoulder and wait for them to go under. And then we went to work. The animal welfare was highest in mind. We took a lot of measurements and then fit them for a collar. The measurements that we took, we would monitor their vitals, like their oxygen and pulse. We would get a weight by actually lifting them on a scale. We would take blood sample from the ear. Where we put in the ear tag, we kept a little plug of tissue that we could do genetic analysis with. We took some hair, pulled a tooth for aging, and then took morphological measurements on our bears. But the most important thing to us was getting that collar on, because most of our goals of this project were for movement data, where bears went. And here I am fitting a collar on a bear. And there's a bear with a fitted collar right there. So you want to read the responses for the time of day that was best?
Yeah, sorry. It looks like early morning, evening was 92%, and there was 1 vote for working hours and nothing for sleeping hours.
Okay. Well, we got you there a little bit. And this was a surprise to us. Daylight hours, especially late morning, proved to be our most successful times at catching bears. They were active about the same times we were. It's not that we saw them all the time, but that was the time that we had most of our captures, not overnight and not necessarily early in the morning or late in the evening. Our captures looked like this. There was a learning curve to it. And in our very first trip, in 10 days, we caught just 7 bears. And contrast that to our last trip, the second trip in 2018, when we caught 7 bears in a day. So we learned, it was fun learning. Our first 2 trips in 2016 were both to Esther Island. And then our first 2 trips in 2017 were to Night Island. And then 2018 was to kind of improve our samples in both areas. And I'll show you this data of what we tried to do. So on the left, you see locations from our first batch of bears that we caught on Esther Island. And we saw a couple holes, like the very southeast corner of Esther Island. We didn't have any bears. So when we went back in 2018, we tried to fill that gap with some bears caught in that area. And we did that. And then on Night Island in 2017, you can see where we caught our bears and a few gaps in there, especially between Johnson Bay, Lower Herring Bay, and Bay of Isles. And we went back in 2018 and tried to fill those gaps and caught several bears in those areas. So in the areas that we were looking at, we wanted, pretty consistent coverage. This is what we did catch. And it got off to that slow start with 7 bears in 10 days, but we ended up catching over 100 bears, 96 unique bears, and it was evenly split between Esther and Night. We deployed 53 collars, a few more to Esther than Night. And so now we have attrition. These collars, and I'll show you what the collars do, but they drop off after a couple seasons. And many of them have dropped off now because we're well past the final season that we trapped. We've had mortalities and we've had some collar failures and a few unknowns. But right now, this is the approximate number of active collars is about 15, 11 on Esther and 4 on Night. The collars are amazing because I did VHF collar studies, back in the 90s, where a collar that looked like this only gave a signal that you could receive through a radio, and you'd have to triangulate on either from the ground or an airplane and get a location. Here, flying is expensive, and the weather would prohibit how often you could actually do it. But these things have a lot packed into them, these satellite GPS collars. First, they do have a programmable VHF signal, and you can choose when it's on and when it's off. That helps save batteries. They collect GPS locations. It's programmable, and we had it set to every 5 hours. In other projects, you'd be lucky to fly once a week or twice a week. And then they also have the ability to record temperature. We had that set to twice a day. And activity, we had this set to every 5 minutes, whether they're moving or sitting still. And then they would all those previous things are stored on board, but what we really wanted to get was the location data, and we had that uploaded to a satellite every other day. So all the GPS locations, it would attempt to upload to a satellite every other day. These collars would last 3+ years, and then we had them programmed to drop off. And the first batch of collars released in October of 2019, and our final batch will drop off this fall. Our final 15 collars hopefully will last that long. So what I do is I run to work every day so I can see where the bears are. That's a pretty exciting part about this. This is all the data for one of our bears on Esther Island, and it's over 2,500 locations that we've collected on this bear, this female, so far. And you can kind of see the cluster of points and where she lives on the southeast corner of the island. That's her home range. 68% of our fixes were high quality. In other words, the GPS was able to triangulate for multiple satellites and get a good location. Over 88,000 high quality locations we've received from our bears so far, but over 128,000 locations in total. And on individuals, we've received from 1 to over 3,000 locations per bear. This shows some of the points that we've collected from bears on Esther Island. That shows approximate home range size of some of the females. And then, so that was the bulk of our work and our most important work. We've tried to round it off with some other work. We've attempted some den work to kind of learn a few things, like cub presence when they emerge in the spring, and then to maintain our collars, replace some failed collars. And 2017 through 2020, we've done a little bit of den work. These are a few pictures of us climbing up to dens. In the spring, we would do this in the first week of April before they emerge. This is a picture of a den that we had worked previously. I think we were here to retrieve a camera from it. And these are cubs playing around that den, so we were able to document the cub production from this female. Because our study sites were remote, and even from the air, it's hard to see our bears. This was important information to help learn what our cub production from some of our females were. We certainly didn't get it all. This is a picture that I noticed Charlotte selected for her presentation. In the spring when they emerge, they kind of come in and out and do a lot of napping. This is a female napping in front of her den during that wake-up period. And this is another female emerging that we learned had a yearling cub when she emerged that spring. And a bear that came out of a very tiny den with a couple cubs. Here's her and one of her yearling cubs in front of the den. Here we are walking into a den site. Just looking into a type of a den underneath a big boulder on Esther Island. And then here's one, kind of a combination what Charlotte described, where a root grows over a cave, a rock crevice, and there was a den inside here, and we would crawl inside these dens with our jab stick and a flashlight and look to where we could tranquilize the bears. We couldn't pull the bears out of them. We had to crawl in with them when the times we were going to change collars. Here's a female. She had a cub behind her in the den. Here's another one. We got the pleasure of seeing a female with newborn cubs, little 3-pounders. Here's one of our collared bears at Esther Island with some eating some fish on the shoreline with her older cubs. And then our project was made infamous because of this poaching incident. One of our collared bears was shot out of her den along with the two little cubs. And our camera captured this. First, we saw some unusual behavior where our bear emerged from a den and then went straight to Palmer. And we thought that was a little odd. And then we checked the camera later and we caught it all. And we handed this over to the troopers, and it resulted in a relatively infamous nationally case. It was in the papers. You could search even now, and I'm sure read about it. And then that's what I've got. I just wanted to kind of give credit to the people that pulled this off. First, it was great working with Charlotte in the field and making this all happen. Here we are with one of our favorite old female bears. But it took a lot of people from a lot of places. Here we are on our first outing with 2 Fish and Game employees. Right between Charlotte and I was Steve Bethune, who really helped our trapping game from the beginning. And then between to Charlotte's, our left of Charlotte, is Chris Brockman, who added a lot of expertise to our trapping. But we brought a lot of different people from around the state to help us out on our different crews. And, you know, there were 6 trapping hitches that we were involved with. I brought up a friend of mine from Montana who's trapped bears for 40 years, Tim Thier, and he really helped us with those Aldrich sets. This is our crew with our 50th bear that we captured. That was pretty exciting. And then here's some of the rest of us that helped. Charlotte got her family out on some of the action. We got our law enforcement folks to help with it. My wife got to see what we do. Barbara Leyden from Girdwood got to help. Anyway, all in all, it was a great project. That's what I have.
Okay. So now I'm just going to quickly wrap up, and hopefully we'll have time for a few questions and just tell you about the analysis. So we've submitted a publication to the Wildlife Society Bulletin, and it's focusing on the efficacy of ground-based trapping. And it looked at things like which trap type we used and time of day, temperature, and distance to shore, and how all of those factors influence trap engagement and trap success. Then our next step is characterizing den chronology and locations. And we're doing that using the temperature and activity data that's been stored on the collars. So when we physically retrieve these collars, we can download information. And this graphic is just an example of what that looks like. You can see the orange line is when it's high when they're outside of their dens walking around. When they go in their dens, their movements drop off considerably. And at the same time, this blue line represents their temperature. It's neither body temperature or ambient temperature, but it shows that inside the den, when they're snuggled up around their collar, their temperature is quite a bit higher than when they're out walking around. So we're going to compare and contrast the 2 islands with each other and look for trends there and what kinds of dens they use and when they come out and when they go in. And then our next step will be to use collar locations to explore spatial use patterns, look for differences between male and females as far as how they use coastlines or alpine, differences between the islands, and then also look at whether or not patterns of use and food consumption vary from year to year. And we're really interested in 2018 because that's a year that had very potential multi-species berry collapse and also potentially some fish resource constrictions. And we saw our bears using fish resources more heavily in those years than other years. So we're investigating those patterns. But we still have bigger questions. We'd still like to know how many bears there are in Prince William Sound, what an acceptable level of harvest is. And we're still hoping that some genetic tools may be useful to us in answering some of these questions. And we hope to explore some past harvest data, maybe comparing with the Kenai and learn some things through looking at that too. And now we'll see what kind of questions that you have. And thank you for letting us talk today.
Yeah, thank you. It looks like we have a number of questions. The first one, is there any way to account for bears that are taken illegally or poached? And how is the harvest information gathered?
So harvest information, you know, our best harvest information is from sealed bears or from our harvest reports. And obviously when someone's taking a bear illegally, we don't have the ability to get that information. So we rely on our enforcement staff to set stings and to create an environment where people want to be truthful about their harvest and share information with us. But yeah, our project won't be illuminating anything about missing bears, because most of the time when they go missing, they're just missing.
And we got extremely lucky to capture that one incident that did happen. I don't think that's representative of denning bears or anything. It was fortuitous that we had that one camera in the one place.
Right. What feedback are you guys getting now, or at least in recent years pre-pandemic, about the public's impression of black bear abundance? Is it rising again from
Yes.
perception?
Yeah, the calls I've gotten, and again, I'm getting them from a diverse range of users, are generally that things are improving. And one thing that we saw with our project is we have years that are very underrepresented by our 96 bears. And so if you were born during snowpocalypse, it looks like you didn't have a very good chance of surviving to adulthood. And even for the years following that, based on our age representation in our collared animals or captured animals. But we think 2015 was a really great year for cub production, and we're starting to see animals from that cohort show up in the population. So I think so then the success rate improvement, the percent taken females improvement, and then age classes that seem to be more heavily represented than the ones we were missing are all good signs to me.
And overall harvest has definitely climbed right back up there.
Yeah, harvest is still only at 1990s levels, but it's improved from where it got.
Excellent. Are there any plans to continue these trapping studies in the future? Is there any long-term study goals?
Not at this time. This project is wrapping up, but I'm hoping that there will be more bear work in the future, and it's just a hard time. State funding isn't very generous right now, and generally black bears don't really come out on top in that when budgets are being allocated.
But we have data to play around for a number of years. That'll be ongoing, but not working with hands-on bears except for just the few collars that we have remaining.
I guess I have a question. Is there, how is this research currently informing harvest regulations, or how do you see it informing it?
I think it's really contributed to my understanding of overall just the life history of bears, what they're doing and how they're doing it. And that's making it easier for me to just kind of conceptualize what needs to happen. And then I think when we understand more about their spatial use patterns, that could be helpful as far as dealing with the question when some people say, well, we were just taking more females during that time because females use the beach more, when we can answer that conclusively. Well, females don't use the beach more, and that can't be used to explain why we had high percent take of females. I really think it's changed my understanding of how I think when we're taking a lot of females, it's because of a cub problem. And I was not thinking about that the same way before. So that's how I think it's helped.
Cool. And then the last question is, did you guys see any bears that were swimming across Esther Passage?
We did.
For the longest time with our radio colored sample, we didn't see that, but we've seen it a couple times, and most of it, or the first times we saw it, were associated with the poor berry year that we saw, 2018. And I took out the slides because I wanted to keep this short, but we saw some amazing increases in their wanderings, their ranges in 2018, and several swam north of Esther Island that year, but those bears all came back. So yes, they do, but we hadn't seen much of it before that berry shortage year. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you guys. Really, really interesting presentation. And I think that's kind of we're wrapping it up for the day. So thanks for taking us out.
Thank you.
I'll join us again. Yeah. So I want to, big shout out to Milo and Charlotte. That was awesome. Super interesting. And to all the presenters today. If you did miss any of these presentations, we will have them posted. Actually, they'll be available on this Crowdcast site for another week. And then we'll have them posted on at princewilliamsound.org. On that website, they'll be archived there. So anybody can go back and rewatch them, or you can share them with a friend, but they will be available. If you're interested in volunteering with the Prince William Sound Stewardship Foundation, you can find out more information also on their website at princewilliamsound.org, or follow them on Facebook and Instagram. The Natural History Symposium is an annual event, and it's organized and run by all volunteers. We're always looking for fresh ideas and motivated individuals who want to contribute. If you want to support the good work that the foundation is doing, consider becoming a member, and you can do that on the website at princewilliamsound.org. I'd like to thank the Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council, the City of Whittier, the Chugach School District, and the U.S. Forest Service for their partnership with the Natural History Symposium to pull off this event. It does take a lot of time and work and planning, so thank you. And also thanks to some sponsors, the Discovery Voyages, Glacier Jet Ski Adventures, Girdwood Bookkeeping, and Will Melton Media Productions. And of course, thank you to the volunteers who made this event possible. Paul Tordock, Tori Vandersummen, Kelly Bender, Peter Denmark, Tim Leiden, Betsy Oliver, and Will Melton, especially Betsy and Will for their expertise in tech hosting and getting us all lined out in this new virtual world. And thanks to all of you guys for joining, and have a great summer. And hopefully we get to see you out in the Sound. Thank you.